Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and senior doctors and dignitaries from the town, senior physicians, our additional CMO, Dr. Kulshrest, ADM, Sri Sanjay Pandey ji, Dr. N.K. Jain, Dr. V.K. Agrawal Sahab. So, to begin with, since we are having a series of academic activities during this COVID period, initially we spent our 1.5 month as a clinician. Now, with the advice of our respected DM, Sri Andhra Vamsi ji, we have started these clinical activities and some academic activities. So for last 1 month, every Saturday we are having meeting from 5 to 6 on different topics. In the same sequence, this evening I will be speaking on some subject and that is related with diabetes and COVID. And the title is Diabetes, Obesity, and Insulin Resistance in COVID-19 Interrelationship. In fact, we are having so many diabetes patients in our country, and India is the second largest capital, world capital for diabetes. There are around 90 million people suffering of diabetes in our country. So this is second after the China, but that is having more population than India. So already one pandemic was there in India and all over the world, that was diabetes. And for last 1.5 year, we are having another pandemic, that is COVID-19. So there is a collision between the two global pandemics of COVID-19 and type 2 diabetes, which led to the grim reality that type 2 diabetes is already the most common morbidity, comorbidity of COVID-19. And the factor is the hyperglycemia, that is the raised blood sugar, which worsens the prognosis. It determines the seriousness of the prognosis and also increases the mortality risk. Why this hyperglycemia is a threat for COVID-19? When we go in details, we find that there is a acute increase in the blood sugar level and a huge increase of the inflammatory mediators, which we know as cytokine storm, in the form of CRP, IL-6, D dimer, etc. in COVID-19. And this hyperglycemia also induces glycosylation of ACE2 receptors. It's very important. In the other slides, in the next slides, again, I will be talking of these ACE receptors, which are responsible for the worsening of the COVID-19, especially with reference to diabetes. So high and aberrantly glycosylated ACE2 in the tissue in uncontrolled hyperglycemia favors cellular intrusion of SARS-CoV virus 2. That means if there is a high level of glycosylated ACE2 in the blood, that means the penetration of virus will be more and the disease will be the worse. In a healthy individual, the level is already low. That's why most of the people, despite of this COVID era, did not have any symptoms or did not get the disease. Second thing, that it's leading to a higher propensity to COVID-19 infection with a higher disease severity if the ACE level is very high. Diabetes, when we see in the time of COVID-19 pandemic, we find that novel coronavirus, it's a global pandemic, and special aspects to COVID-19 infection in people with diabetes. There are two factors that people, those who are having diabetes, in corona period, they are having very high risk of infection, especially to the influenza and the pneumonia. And the disease is very severe when infected with the respiratory viruses. So when people with diabetes, they develop a viral infection, it can be harder to treat. It's very difficult to treat them due to the fluctuation in blood glucose levels. And that is very difficult to manage. And possibly the presence of diabetes complications, especially the CKD, then CAD, or some respiratory infections like COPD, so many diseases, when they are associated with diabetes, the treatment part is very, very difficult. And the sugar level also varies. So older people and people with pre-existing medical conditions like along with diabetes like heart diseases, asthma, or renal diseases, they appear to be more vulnerable in COVID-19 virus. What's the reason? Because the immune system is compromised in these patients, and it's making harder to fight the virus and likely leading to a longer recovery period. That's why those who are diabetics, even they after recovery, they are taking 1 month, 2 month, 3 month period for the recovery. Second thing, that virus may thrive in an environment of elevated blood sugar. So blood sugar control was a must, and still even in a post-COVID period, if you don't control the blood sugar, then the recovery will be very, very late. So what is the possible link between the diabetes and the COVID-19? One thing is, this is what I have told you already, that ACE2 and inhibition of the renin-angiotensin system. And second is the alteration of the immune system in the people with diabetes. So ACE2 and inhibition of the renin-angiotensin system, especially in the healthy individuals, what we find that there is a lower level, low circulating ACE2, while in the patients of diabetes, hypertension and nephropathy, the circulating ACE2 is increased, and that is the reason the prognosis is very, very poor. And many people with cardiovascular complications and nephropathy due to the diabetes are prescribed ACE inhibitors also, and angiotensin 2 receptor blockers, which are known as ARBs, for cardiovascular and renoprotective effects. So use of ACE inhibitors and ARBs may upregulate ACE2. Then ACE inhibitors, they also increase ACE2 by inhibiting the formation of angiotensin 2, and subsequently is then negative regulation of ACE2. So what is the alteration of the immune system in the people with diabetes? Why the disease is very severe when they are having diabetes along with COVID? These individuals with diabetes are at increased risk of infection due to the dysregulation of innate and humoral immune system. We know that there are two kind of immunity. One is the innate and second is the humoral. So both is defective in these patients. There is a dysregulation. And second is acute hyperglycemia that also impairs neutrophil phagocytosis and bactericidal activity and respiratory burst capacity, and that leads to formation of granular elastase and myeloperoxidase extracellular traps, leading to susceptibility of the infection. And that's the reason, because many of the patients, they complain that they have taken 2 doses of the vaccine and after that they had COVID. So what is the reason? I think the vaccine was defective or the vaccine is not effective. This is what they claim. But in fact, their immune system is not good. They are immunocompromised. They are either innate or humoral immunity is not good. That's why whether there is a variant of the virus, it will affect them. And the effect of the drug, say of this vaccine, will be not like that, like which we get in a healthy individual. So these are the reasons that many people, despite of vaccination, they are having this COVID. Now we come to the molecular mechanism, what we find with the insulin resistance. Already I've talked about the diabetes, then the obesity is one, then insulin resistance is then, and how these all three things, they are linked with the COVID-19. So there is a integrated stress response that is known as ISR. On one side, we find that there is the stress signal, and this stress signal leads to altered insulin signaling. So stress is also one of the factor in diabetes. Stress, in this COVID era, we found this people, those who are suffering of diabetes, they were having two other factors. I welcome our principal, Dr. N.S. Sanger Saab, to this hall. Should I continue, sir? Molecular mechanism of insulin resistance in COVID-19. So there is a stress signal, and second, that leads to altered insulin signaling. And second part is the viral infection. In addition to that, there is some comorbidity like, say, insulin resistance or obesity or stress. So these multiple factors, stress also leads to hyperglycemia, raised blood sugar. Then diabetes itself is responsible for that. So these multiple factors, along with this PKR, PERK, and AFT6 and HR1, they leads to integrated stress response, and that is responsible for this disease. And this insulin resistance also increases the inflammation. How it is correlated? Because insulin resistance induced inflammation, when we talk of it, although it is well accepted that inflammation in obesity can induce insulin resistance. So recent evidence suggests that the opposite to this is also true. That means vice versa, that insulin resistance by itself can also induce inflammation. So inflammation induces insulin resistance in diabetes, and insulin resistance is there, then it may also cause or induce inflammation. So, insulin resistance in adipose tissue induces macrophage infiltration, developing in inflammatory state. When we talk of the obesity with reference to the diabetes and COVID-19, we find that increase in the basal inflammatory response and a potential decrease in the interferon response is there. Thus, the synergy between COVID-19 and type 2 diabetes along with obesity may amplify the inflammatory response and down-regulate even more than the interferon response. And that contributes to more severe disease in these patients. So these are multiple, say, comorbid conditions like diabetes, obesity, then insulin resistance, which are almost co-sisters of each other, that worsens the conditions of COVID-19. COVID, the obesity, which is a risk factor for COVID-19, and the mechanism is that T cell insulin resistance is there and exhaustion in obesity, and that is because of the immunological dysfunction, because of two factors which leads to an altered immune response not only to the virus but also to a future vaccine. Second is alteration of myeloid and lymphoid response within the adipose tissue, consequently leads to an abbreviation of adipokine profiles. Obesity is linearly associated with the raised C-reactive protein and is triggered by the adipocytic derived interleukin 6. CRP has been reported to provide a pathophysiological link between obesity and poor COVID 19 outcomes. Higher levels of pro-inflammatory DPP4 levels, the drugs which we use in the diabetes is also DPP4 inhibitors like vildagliptin and other drugs. So here we talk of DPP4 levels which are seen in obesity, and the consequent hyperinsulinemia may both independently exacerbate COVID-19 risk. Independently, independently, when we talk of it, we find that there is a higher risk of thrombosis, which is especially relevant to the COVID-19, as COVID-19 has an increased predilection for the microangiopathy and the venous thrombosis. So in these patients, the risk of microangiopathy, venous thrombosis is more when people they suffer with diabetes along with COVID. Coexisting obesity, hypoventilation syndrome, and obstructive sleep apnea, both complications of obesity, may compromise respiratory function that could also account for the observed effects. On one hand, here we have shown the diabetes and obesity, and on the other hand, there is COVID-19. We have compared both the things. In diabetes, we find insulin resistance, chronic inflammatory state, endothelial dysfunction, hyperglycemia, and the hypertension associated, maybe or may not be. Similarly, in COVID-19, we have seen insulin resistance, inflammatory state, and endothelial dysfunction, which was responsible for thrombosis. When we talk of various organs like brain, lung, heart, kidney, and the circulation, we find that these two diseases like co-sisters. Here is the brain damage to the blood vessels and nerves and leading to stroke. I have also seen one patient of stroke in my hospital also. And second thing, damage to the blood vessels and nerves and leading to stroke. Similarly, in the lung, we find decreased diaphragm in diabetes, excretion, and lung function because of obesity. And COVID-19, there is a pulmonary inflammation, and sometimes the worst part is ARDS. In heart, we find heart failure, CVD, atrial fibrillation, myocardiopathy, and again, there in COVID, heart failure and myocarditis is seen. Kidney, we find DKD, proteinuria, ischemia, and in COVID, again, there is a acute kidney injury, proteinuria, and hematuria. Similarly, in the circulation, we find raised level of TNF, interferon, CRP, coagulation factors. And here again, in COVID-19, there is a cytokine storm, and coagulation. And so many markers they are raised. So coming to the last few slides, here I have summarized them in various phases of COVID along with the diabetes. So there are four phases: phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. We all know in that phase 1 there is a viral entrance in the cells, which is felicitated by ACE2, and there are certain symptoms like dry cough, fever, which everyone gets. Sometimes there is a loss of taste and feels a general malaise. When we talk of phase 2, there is a immune cell migration to the lungs. And these phase 1 patients can be managed at the home also even. In phase 2, immune cell migration to the lungs is there. Individuals, they develop pulmonary inflammation and pneumonia. And pneumonia can be again subdivided in 2A and 2B. 2A means then pneumonia is there, but hypoxia is not there. In 2B, pneumonia is there, but hypoxia is there, so you require oxygen for these patients. And most of the patients, they require hospitalization in phase 2. Some of them, they may have a prolonged hypoxia and may need mechanical ventilation also. When we talk of phase 3, the patient, they develop ARDS like symptoms, ARDS and extrapulmonary systemic hyperinflammation syndrome, shock, vasoplasia, respiratory failure, very complicated things they are. Then cardiopulmonary collapse, myocarditis, and acute kidney injury and poor prognosis and increased mortality. This is the phase in which most of the people, they don't survive. And if they survive, then there is a phase of recovery, then that is known as phase 4. So the same thing has been summarized here, that there is a sickness is there, then recovery part is there, then health, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. And one thing again I would like to emphasize, in that in phase 2, pneumonia without hypoxia, and phase 2B, pneumonia with hypoxia, where you require the oxygen. So what are the general recommendations for the management of hyperglycemia in patients with type 2 diabetes and COVID-19? Glycemic goals are to be achieved in these patients, and fasting blood sugar is to be maintained at 6.1 millimole per liter. Since we are talking in milligrams in our contest, so this 6.1 is to be multiplied with 18. 18. 1 millimole is equal to 18 milligram of blood sugar. So roughly 120, 126 blood sugar fasting is required, and postprandial should be around 148 to 50. For the older patient, the range is little higher. Even the 140 fasting is okay, and 160, 70 postprandial is okay. For the older patient, those who are more than 70, we should say 130 to 140 fasting, and up to 180 postprandial is okay to manage, because the hypoglycemia is equally worse in these conditions. So these hospitalized patients with diabetes with COVID-19, tight glucose monitoring is essential and optimize clinical outcomes. CGM devices in the traditional way still carries a risk of viral transmission, so they are not being used. And remote monitoring with CGM devices efficiently means to reduce exposure to the risk of COVID-19, especially to the patients, to the doctors, and to the nurse. And the main goals of in-hospital glucose monitoring are to limit normal glycemic variability. These are certain pharmacological agents. Our Dr. Anshul Agrawal will be discussing this pharmacological part. So I'm not going in details. I will just say one or two things, that metformin is associated with lactic acidosis in COVID patients. And to other drug, SGLT2 inhibitors, they, when they are used, there is a risk of diabetic ketoacidosis. So these two molecules are not to be used when person is having diabetes and suffering of COVID-19. And the ideal way to manage all these patients is with the help of regular insulin. So this is the part of the management which will be covered by Dr. Anshul Agrawal ji. And now I just say about the barriers and solution, especially in our country, India. What are the things? Because of that, we have to manage some different kind of treatment. So one is the attitude barrier, second is communication, third is cultural. So in attitude barrier, many individuals, they lack confidence in the importance of the home-based care in the diabetes management. They think that when they are at home, they are not sure whether sometimes if the sugar or say this oxygen level goes down, then what they will do, they may die also. So there is a fear, especially when they are in the house. So they approach to get hospitalized. So that is the attitude barrier. Second is the communication barrier. For that, we require good books, educational videos, scientific information, which is to be provided by the government to the patient. So similar, many of the things, they are being put on the banners, on the boards, so people, they are aware that what to do, what not to do, and how to keep yourself away from the COVID infection, like using the mask and other things. So the public education was well in this scenario, and the internet access using, but it is not possible for all people. And the telemedicine, hardly say 20%, 30% people, they know the use of telemedicine, especially the patient part is there. So third is the cultural barrier, and culture plays a huge part in the diet. Especially these people are to be promoted for a very high protein diet, and it must be individualized to meet the total caloric goals to maintain glycemic control, because when person is suffering of the diabetes, many of the family members even fear to go near to them. So whatsoever they have, some dal, some roti, they give it. They don't know that they are to be given good proteins also for a good recovery. And the last two are the socio-economic barrier. That one part is that poor access to the patient centered care, internet, and lack of affordability in the maintaining a good balanced diet, especially in the village areas. And government can find a way to provide them with free high quality generic drugs and educational pamphlets, which was done in this second wave, but in first it was very difficult. And third thing is the legal barriers. We all know that the physicians always have been skeptical about using telemedicine in their practice owing to lack of definite legislation in India. And recently, the government guidelines they issued by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare on teleconsultation have enabled physicians to facilitate self-management by a teleconsultation after overcoming the barriers. So now it is possible that we can give some consultation to the patient, which was not possible in the past. So to summarize this all, COVID, diabetes, then obesity and insulin resistance, I will like to say two lines that pathophysiology of COVID-19 includes viral entrance, direct viral toxicity, endothelial dysfunction, thromboinflammation, dysregulation of the immune response, and the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And there is a synergy of the insulin resistance of COVID-19 with this hormonal resistance of obesity and diabetes, which increases the severity of the disease. That's all. Thanking you, ladies and gentlemen, for the patience. Any queries or questions? I'm there to welcome. हाँ बताइए. Insulin resistance. Now, if insulin resistance is there, then the inflammation is more, especially in the lung parenchyma. And lung parenchymal inflammation also increases the this part insulin resistance. So they are, I said it is vice versa is true. If there is some inflammation and insulin resistance is there, and there is a viral pneumonia, the prognosis is very, very poor.
It is reversible or not?
No, it is reversible. It depends on your two types of this immunity, innate and the humoral. So that is the role, because many people, despite of having a lot of infection, did not suffer a lot. So that was the reason that it was their own immunity. And many of our doctors, those who were working in the wards, and they were say almost exposed to 6 7 hours in the wards and in so many meetings also, sitting in a hall together. It was your immunity that gave you life.
Okay. And can you
Hmm.
can you brief in short what is the relationship between the obesity and the COVID-19 basically, and how it affect the COVID person?
These say obesity, you get this sleep distress, some difficulty in breathing also, because the expansion of the lungs is not that, diaphragm doesn't go down, so obstructive apnea is there. So that is one of the reason for obesity.
Is COVID affect the internal organ very seriously? What is about it?
Definitely, I've told you a series of it affects the brain, it affects the heart, it affects the kidneys, every part is affected. Even acute kidney injury is there. I have just shown in the slides. We have compared this obesity, diabetes on one end, and the say this COVID-19 on the other end, and both have shown that very say multiple organs damage is there. Even I have seen stroke. I have seen in with our patients. We have seen some kidney problems also associated, and they got worsened. So the only thing you can protect, that you should control sugar levels. Say with the small, say whatsoever the dose, but the simple say regular insulin can be given 3 times, 4 times, even 5 times, depending upon the sugar level, and that you manage in between 120 to 180. If the person is aged, 140 to 200 is okay. If the person is adult, then very tight control, say 100 से लेके 140 milligram. If you manage sugar level, if you manage, and don't give any metformin, don't give any SGLT2 inhibitors like UDAPA, DAPA, whatsoever brands are available, because they worsen the conditions. So even the patient, they were on this metformin or say on SGLT2 inhibitors. These drugs are to be stopped, and the best way is without any agitation, you start only with single drug, that is insulin, for controlling the sugar. Once the patient is okay, after a month, you can start again metformin and or some say DPP4, whatsoever you like or whatsoever patient is comfortable.
If the patient is already on Mixtard or Glarcine, so he has to stop and go for the regular insulin, or he can continue with the same insulin.
And the easy way, if you give a regular insulin, then the chances of hypoglycemia are less. Suppose if you give Mixtard 30/70 mixture or some, then in the night if the blood sugar goes down, then it is very difficult to manage. But if you give a regular one, then after 2 3 hours you check the blood sugar, it is uh, high, again you can give it say 10 units, 12, 14, depending upon the blood sugar level. So once the person is okay, then you can again start anything. The best way is to start, it is the simple way. What I mean, it is simple way that if diabetes is there, don't give any drugs orally, you start only with the insulin, that too only plain regular insulin.
So one has to
After,
stop the insulin. Previous
yes,
insulin, he has to just start by the
uh,
regular insulin.
your sugar should be controlled, and those patients, those who were having a sugar control during the hospitalization, they survived well also.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I invite Dr. Anshul Agarwal to take second part. इसको निकाल लूं?
So, good evening to DM sir, Andre Vamsi sir, good evening principal sir, and good evening to all my seniors, my colleagues and my juniors. Today I would be discussing about a very important topic, managing hyperglycemia in COVID-19 patient. So, we all might admit that during this second wave of COVID, we all have faced a very difficult scenario in all these COVID patients that we couldn't control their sugars, especially when the patients were on steroids. So, sir has already very well explained, Dr. R.R. Singh sir, that steroids per se will cause insulin resistance. COVID-19 also causes insulin resistance, and because of which, if you are starting the patient on steroids, the patient sugar status become very bad, and they go into the phase of very high sugars, and it becomes very difficult for us to control the sugars, and they might land up in problems when the sugars become more than 400 to 500, especially in controlling the COVID-19 COVID disease per se. They might land up in more comorbidities like ARDS, myocarditis, AKI. And so, in all, we have to control this properly. And with this, I would hope so that we can manage. If the third wave comes, we could manage the hyperglycemia part better in the third wave. So I can see here that we have many paramedicals as well as non-medical people also. So I will just dedicate 4 slides for those for the guidance for the people with diabetes on COVID-19. Coming to the global world burden, if you see in the world, almost 463 million people are suffering from COVID, and it is expected to increase by 51% in 2045. So the global burden is going to increase. And specifically, if you see in Southeast Asia, which includes India also, it has been seen that it has been postulated that in 2045 it will increase to more than 74%. So Southeast Asia, which includes China as well as India, the burden is going to increase. So we must be well aware of the fact of how to treat diabetes and what all things are there in the diabetes. So burden of type 2 diabetes, you can see. So this is the 2019 data. In all over world, 1 in 11 patients are already suffering from diabetes. Prevalence of diabetes in India is almost 8.9%. And you can see that out of three, one patient is already suffering from a cardiac disease, and 40% of patients are already suffering from chronic kidney disease in diabetics. So it is a huge burden on society, and it has to need to be handled very carefully. COVID-19 in diabetic patients, sir has very well explained that there are multiple serious complications which can happen in COVID-19. So we have to be very careful while treating this thing, especially the diabetic patient. And mortality rate has been found to be very high in patients who are diabetes. So it's around 9 to 10% who are diabetic, and as compared to a general public, which is only 3 to 4%. So this is just to brief and just suggest that diabetes, how we diagnose diabetes when fasting blood sugar is more than 126 and 2 are PPBS, that is postprandial blood sugar is more than 200, random blood sugar, any blood sugar more than 200, and HbA1c is more than 6.5. And there comes the one more subtype, which is pre-diabetes, which are also having a fasting blood sugar of 100 to 125, 2 are postprandial 140 to 199, and HbA1c 5.64. These are the patients which develop hyperglycemia when they are started on steroid. These were the patients when they were not having any history of diabetes. But once we start steroid, they become further insulin resistant and they convert from pre-diabetes to diabetes at that stage. So what we suggest to general public is that we should always monitor the self-monitoring of blood glucose, which can be done at the home also. We should check the sugar before meals, that is 3 readings, before breakfast, before lunch, before dinner, and then 2 hours after meal, which is again 3 reading, after breakfast, after lunch, and after dinner. So what should be the target of all these reading which they are measuring at home? So fasting should come between 80 to 130, and after food should at least come less than 180. Target HbA1c, which is the estimate of 3 months average blood sugar. This is to be done with a very good lab, which is having standardized to DCCT assay, because lot of variability comes with the HbA1c assays if you are not doing with that in a good lab. So this is what our target is, and if the diabetic patient has maintaining all these things in a proper way, he might be we might prevent him from all the microvascular as well as macrovascular complication of diabetes. Plus, he might have less complication related to COVID-19 also. So and this was I told about self-monitoring of blood glucose. There's some newer advances also, where because I have already told that 6-point charting has to be done. That is 6 times you have to check in a day. There are new advances where there is continuous glucose monitoring system. We just place a sensor over the arm and just we can see the reading in the mobile like a system. And this reading is every 15 minutes. So in 24 hours, you can get almost 100 readings. So in this sensor works for 14 days. So in 14 days, you will get 1400 readings. So that is quite a lot. And with that, we can also adjust our blood sugar. This is how you can get a graph of that continuous glucose monitoring system. And uh, this is the report of one of my patient, and his target range, which we should be between 70 to 180, was 47%. So ideal target range in this CGMS device should be 70%, more than 70%. So this is what we aim for, and we should cut down the ups and downs which are happening in this, like this is going hyper and some are going low. All these things has to be cut off, and we have to improve the glycemic variability of that patient. So this is how we can improve with this CGMS newer advances. So this was all just a insight upon the diabetes. We'll come to the topic per se, managing hyperglycemia in the COVID-19 patient. So I'll just start with how we initiate insulin, not in IPD patient, but also we can initiate the insulin in OPD patient. Usually, usual dose is 0.5 units per kg. That is half of the body weight. So if a 60 kg person present to us, his normal requirement will be 30 units. However, this thing can increase if the patient become insulin is quite insulin resistant. As we can see with the clinical features, there can be signs of insulin resistance, as in case of acanthosis, nigricans, or skin tags. So we have to start the higher dose, that is 0.75 units per kg. But if the patient is very lean, frail, and already having a comorbs, we can start with a lesser dose of insulin sensitive with 0.3 units per kg. And if the patient is on steroid, we can directly start the patient with 1 unit per kg, because we know that steroids increases the insulin resistance and patient will become severely insulin resistant. So usual dose, as I have suggested, for a 60 kg is 30 units. It should be divided into basal and bolus. 4-time insulin basal bolus is the best regimen which we can offer to a patient, because that is most physiological. This is how basal and bolus regimen works. Breakfast, you give 1 bolus dose of insulin. Lunch, you again give a bolus dose of insulin. Dinner, you again give a bolus dose. And that time, you give a basal dose. And that gives a whole lot of insulin over 24 hours, which can be present over 24 hours. So this is the best physiological way. And another what we can offer is a pre-mixed twice-day insulin, and that is not that physiological. Especially in type 1 diabetes, we should always offer a basal bolus. Type 2 diabetes, we can be little relaxed and we can start pre-mixed insulin. But it is always better to start a basal bolus if the patient allows. So this is how a 60 kg individual, if just for a sort of example, if it comes to IPD, we can directly start with 30 units insulin. 30 units, 40 to 50% should be divided. This is total daily doses, 30 units. 40% should be divided into the basal. 40% of 30 will be 12 units. So 12 units you have to give Lantus, and 60% of bolus is 18 units. So 18 units has to be divided either equally before breakfast, before lunch, before dinner, 666, or you can just give a higher at the breakfast and lower at the dinner, because we generally, Indian diet is more of carbohydrate, and that carbohydrate diet is more in the breakfast. So we should start the diet more in, we can increase the insulin dose more in the breakfast, and then gradually decrease to lunch, and dinner, it might be a lesser dose. So this is how we generally start. But in COVID-19, and I'll just tell, and then how we can adjust also. This is how we have already started a patient on IPD. And then if the fasting is still high and patient fasting is more than 130, we can always increase the Lantus dose or glargine dose or any basal dose for, let's say, we can increase to 2 to 4 units. And correctional dose for pre-meal or post-meal has to be calculated by a insulin sensitivity factor. That is 1500 by total daily dose. This 1500 is for regular insulin, and if we are using any analog, it has to be 1800 by total daily dose. So if that patient requirement was 30, 1500 by 30 is equal to 50. So that is the insulin sensitivity factor for that patient. So insulin, what does that mean? Insulin sensitivity factor means that to decrease 50 milligram of plasma glucose of that patient, you need 1 unit insulin. So if any patient whose pre-meal is 220, you found out that pre-meal is 220, you have to give added correctional dose. Ideal pre-meal, what we think is, it should be between 80 to 130. If we say 120, so to reduce from 220 to 120, you will need additional 2 units of insulin, because 50 units is going to reduce, 50 milligram is going to reduce by 1 unit, and 100 milligram from 220 to 120 we will be needing 2 units. So this is how we can also correct. So this is how we do in general with each and every patient who is um, not who is not suffering from COVID-19. This is in general. But current scenario, what we face challenges, tend to start steroid, and there's also overuse of steroid in the COVID scenario, and our job become very difficult. Recent trial, recovery trial, has already shown that in moderate to severe COVID-19, dexamethasone therapy is very useful, but it is likely to affect the glycemic control or hyperglycemia due to COVID-19, and that might be harmful in recovery of that COVID-19 patient. So we have to be very careful while starting steroid, and it has been found that incidence of steroid induced hyperglycemia is almost like 34 to 56. You can see that out of 3, one patient, or uh, out of 2, one patient is already having a steroid induced hyperglycemia. So we should always check a sugar of that patient, and should not underdiagnose that thing. So steroid induced hyperglycemia, broadly we can categorize into three types. It could be either exacerbation of existing type 2 diabetes after starting steroid, or it can be a newly discovered diabetes, means patient was undiagnosed and patient got hospitalized, and there he was found to have sugar of 400. When we did HbA1c, it was quite high. So patient was undiagnosed diabetic, and now he was diagnosed. Or it could be just a transient hyperglycemia without pre-existing diabetes. These are the maximum number of patients are in the pre-diabetic range in this category. So this is the three types of steroid which we in steroid-induced hyperglycemia which we can see. So coming to the most important part, that steroid which we are using are mainly 4 types, and in this second wave, every ICU or the ward hospital have used either hydrocortisone on a lesser part, prednisolone, methylprednisolone, or dexamethasone. If you see, 20 milligram of hydrocortisone is equal to 5 milligram of prednisolone, is equal to 4 milligram of methylprednisolone, and 0.75 milligram of dexamethasone. So the most important part comes with the duration of the action of these drugs. Hydrocortisone has the lowest duration of action, 8 hours. So we should ideally give a insulin which has most pharmacological profile compared to hydrocortisone. And for 8-hour duration of action, we have regular insulin, which peak at around 2 to 4 hours, and duration of action goes by 8 hours. So for hydrocortisone, we should always give a regular insulin. And then prednisolone. Prednisolone and methylprednisolone are little moderate, have a good amount of moderate duration of action, and dexamethasone has the longest duration of action. So prednisolone, methylprednisolone are acting for 16 to 18 hours. So for to cover this pharmacological profile of this steroid, we have a drug, insulin NPH, which also act for 16 to 18 hours and peak by 4 hours. So we should always give a NPH prior to prednisolone or methylprednisolone. And then comes the dexamethasone. This is the longest acting and has duration of action of almost 36 to 54 hours. So we should always give a long acting insulin. And for long acting insulin, we have Glargine or Degludec, which are available in the market. And we should always prefer giving these insulin, whichever steroid we are starting. So this is what I suggested is hydrocortisone. It is recommended we should give regular insulin. Prednisolone, methylprednisolone, we should give NPH. Dexamethasone, we should give Glargine. So overall, I will now divide the inpatient management of diabetes with COVID-19 into 3 phases. 3 phases is the initial management, then the continuation phase, and then we'll plan the discharge of the patient. So initial management, this is the first star management, is the most important part. So whenever the patient gets admitted, you just check a RBS on admission. If the RBS on admission is more than 400, we always consider a DKA or HHNS state, that is hyperglycemic hyperosmolar non-ketotic state. Try to give a fluid resuscitation to that patient, and always consider starting an insulin infusion, because you will not be able to control with the regular insulins alone. However, if RBS on admission was between 200 to 400 and steroids are supposed to be given, or RBS was less than 200 of that patient, and HbA1c was high and steroids was to be given. So what we can do is, we have to see which steroid. If you are giving prednisolone, as I have told before, we should prednisolone or methylprednisolone, we should give NPH. How much NPH is to be given? This can be calculated by this units, like zero point 0.1 unit per kg for every 10 milligram of prednisolone. So if we are using 40 milligram of prednisolone for a 50 kg individual, NPH will come around 20 units. So 20 units of NPH should be given prior to prednisolone. Then the for dexamethasone, which is very largest acting, we should always consider giving glargine. How much glargine? It is again zero point 0.1 unit per kg for every 2 milligram of dexa. So one vial of dexa generally is a 2 cc, which we give 8 mg. So if we are giving 8 mg of dexamethasone, we should give zero point 0.3 units per kg, and for a 50 kg individual, it will come around 15 units. So 15 unit glargine has to be given prior to dexamethasone. And if you are using methylprednisolone, especially in a smaller dose, like 40 to 50 milligram, you will again give a NPH, and this is zero point 0.1 unit per kg for every 8 milligram of methylpred. So it for a 40 milligram methylpred, NPH will come around 25 units, and that has to be given. So this is a very important step, and why it is very important is because of glucose toxicity. If patient is presenting with a sugar of 300 and you have jabbed him with a steroid, the sugars will go on to increase, and it will go on to increase by more than 500 also. Patient might land up in decay also. So this increase in the glucose prevents the beta cell also to produce more insulin. It also increases the insulin resistance. So you might have seen also that in spite of giving 100 unit of insulin in a day, you are not able to control the sugar part of that patient. So you have, this is very important step, that we should start with insulin prior to giving a steroid on the first step, and this is the first star management of that patient. So coming to the continuation phase, you have already given a steroid, already given an insulin dose prior to giving steroid. Now patient is admitted and we have to, is admitted for long, we have to give a continuation phase. There can be two scenarios when patient is presenting with RBS more than 400. So RBS, if patient is presenting with more than 400, we generally tend to start an insulin infusion. So how can we start an insulin infusion? We can start an insulin infusion by making 50 units of regular insulin and 50 ml of normal saline. So that means 1 ml will equal to 1 unit of insulin. Approximately, if patient is presenting with a sugar of 400, you can directly divide it by 100, it will give 4 ml per hour. So 4 ml per hour of insulin infusion can be started. Check RBS every 2 hourly, and consider using a Yale protocol or a Duke protocol, which is easily available on the net. This is the Yale protocol, which we can always put on our ICU and advise our nursing staff to use this. This is also called as a Delta protocol. And after starting infusion, we can always use this protocol and control the blood sugar. Target the random blood sugar between 140 to 180 while starting an infusion. So this is how an infusion works. So once the GRBS, that is the glucometer RBS, becomes less than 200, we can stop the insulin, but we have to convert this insulin into basal bolus. How we can convert into basal bolus? We have to calculate the total insulin requirement of that patient in 24 hours. So if I'll give an example for that also later. So if we calculate the 24-hour insulin requirement with the infusion, 80% of that will be total insulin requirement. So 40 to 50% of that total insulin requirement at a total daily dose would be basal, and 50% can be divided again to the bolus. So this is how we can start, and we can start with the um, basal bolus regimen. So for example, if patient achieved a glucose of 200 after 6 hours, in last 6 hours, patient receives 16 units of insulin. So in 24 hours, how much insulin will be required? That will come into 16 into 4, 64 units. So just multiply that figure to 80%. That will give the total daily dose, 50 units. So this is the total daily dose which the patient will require. And this has to be divided into basal, 50% into basal, that is 25, 50% into bolus, that is again 25. And this bolus has to be divided into before breakfast, before lunch, before dinner. So you can give 8 unit before breakfast, 8 unit before lunch, and 8 unit before dinner, and 25 unit lunches. So this is how we can stop the infusion also once the RBS is more than 400. So now coming to the second category of the patient, if patient have the sugar of 200 to 400 at the time of admission. So this is, you already have, you might go to that first chart where we have told that when the sugar was 200 to 400, you should always give a insulin prior to steroid. NPH prior to prednisolone and methylprednisolone, glargine prior to dexamethasone. So now we can check the sugar 4 times before meals and bedtime, and bolus doses of short-acting insulin can be additionally given, can be given. So this is just a self-made protocol which you can give to bolus doses of 100 to 140 units. Patient on steroid, we can directly give 4 units, and just as the glucose level increase by 40, 2 units of insulin has to be added. And once it become more than 40, again consider starting the infusion. So this is how we can also give a bolus to those patients which are presenting with a sugar of 200 to 400. So we have already started a bolus regimen. We have already given a NPH or glargine prior to steroid the day patient was admitted. Next day, we have to check a fasting blood sugar. If fasting blood sugar is high, like if it is more than ideal is 80 to 130. If fasting blood sugar is high, we should consider adding a fixed dose glargine in the evening. And how we can calculate? Roughly, we can calculate by fasting blood sugar minus 40 by 10. So for example, if patient next day fasting glucose was 160, so 160 minus 40, 120 by 10. So we can always give, will come out to be 12 unit. So 12 unit of glargine can be given subcutaneous at 8 to 10 p.m. So again, if fasting is still more, next day, we can always increase the glargine by 2 to 4 unit. So this is how we can start the basal regimen. So I have talked about two patient criteria when sugars were more than 400 or sugars were between 200 to 400. So what about the oral drug in hospitalized COVID-19 patient? As sir has already explained, I will just go in detail now about oral antidiabetic during the continuation phase. So overall, it has been told that oral antidiabetic use in hospitalized patient is controversial. Always insulin is the best regimen which we can offer to the patient, but because there's a lot of insulin resistance which is there because of steroid as well as COVID-19 per se, OADs, they actually can reduce the insulin dose requirement and also reduce the glycemic variability. And this is actually based on expert opinion alone. And it is altogether suggested that we should not use the OAD when patient is very critical or patient is on ventilatory support. So which OAD is useful? It has been found in multiple studies also that DPP-4 inhibitor as well as alpha glucosidase inhibitor, we can always offer to our COVID-19 patient. So overall, what about pros and cons of DPP-4 inhibitor? DPP-4 inhibitor altogether are very safe. Linagliptin and teneligliptin, they do not require dose adjustment as per the GFR. Other gliptin like Sita and Vildagliptin, they require renal dose adjustment. However, just see the past history of pancreatitis. If they are having, avoid DPP-4 inhibitor. Alpha-glucosidase inhibitor, especially acarbose, there are multiple studies with the acarbose that they can blunt the peak of postprandial sugars and particularly useful in patient with steroid-induced hyperglycemia. So you can always consider starting a acarbose, but it should again be avoided if patient is having severe gastroparesis. So these were the drugs which we can give. And other oral drugs which are to be avoided are sulfonylurea, metformin, thiazolidinediones, and SGLT2 inhibitor. We'll go one by one to why sulfonylurea should be avoided. Sulfonylurea, we all know it can cause very unstable glycemia. There are a lot of ups and downs with the sugar, especially when they are hospitalized and when they are on steroid. And there's also a risk of life-threatening hypoglycemia. So we should altogether avoid sulfonylurea. Metformin, as sir has already explained, that there is risk of lactic acidosis, but especially in COVID, there is also severe hypoxia, and hypoxia may again precipitate lactic acidosis. So metformin altogether should be avoided, and it is always best to avoid in a patient, when hospitalized patient, especially in COVID-19. And next comes the SGLT2 inhibitor. Now, the cost of SGLT2, as it has come down, we think of starting the SGLT2 inhibitor in each and every patient, but it might be very dangerous to give SGLT2 inhibitor in hospitalized patient. Why? Because first, they can trigger the euglycemic ketosis in the patient, especially who are those which have relative or absolute insulin deficiency. Then there is also risk of developing UTI in this patient is also quite high. They are already having one infection, you might give another infection in the form of UTI. And third is that there's also a risk of dehydration that can again trigger the risk of venous thrombosis, which is again again a problem with COVID-19 when COVID-19 per se is having a risk of venous thrombosis, and these drugs again can increase the risk of venous thrombosis and pulmonary thromboembolism. So altogether, SGLT2 should not be given. Pioglitazone, if you see, they have very slow onset of action and may not be helpful in acute hyperglycemic situation. And plus, they also cause fluid retention, so they must be best avoided. Now coming to the GLP-1 receptor agonist like liraglutide, dulaglutide. So these have found to be very useful, and they actually cut the peak of hyperglycemia much faster compared to other agent, even the oral agent. The only issue come is the GI disturbance, and they should be avoided in the patient with gastroparesis. However, in my experience, it has been seen that liraglutide, if you give in a low dose, like liraglutide of 0.6 milligram, it does not produce significant GI disturbance, and it will be very instrumental in blunting the peak, especially in steroid-induced hyperglycemia. So we can always consider giving liraglutide into the patients who are admitted when cost is not a constraint. So I will, this was very technical and complicated maybe. So I will just summarize it like with what we can give a sample prescription for patient who is admitted in ward with glucose value of 200 to 400. So this is what we can give is 50 kg patient, you are starting prednisolone of 40 milligram. You can always give NPH 20 units prior to prednisolone. Then around Lantus, you can give 16 units at 10 p.m. Then you can start a regular insulin. Fias is the very good insulin if you can offer to that patient. And Fias has to be given before meal, before breakfast, before lunch, and before dinner. Then you can start a liraglutide 0.6 milligram before lunch. DP4, either liraglutide or DPV4, sitagliptin or linagliptin. And then comes the alpha glucosidase inhibitor, especially the acarbose part, which we can give BD or TDS. So when this is actually, this become very costly, and when the cost is a constraint, you can offer another thing is like you can give NPH 20 units prior to steroid, NPH 12 unit at 10 p.m., and then regular human insulin before meals, DPV4 inhibitor in the form of Vilda, teneligliptin or linagliptin, and again you can give a voclibose or acarbose. So this is how we can, this is just a sample prescription which we can offer to the patient. This has shown very good result, and we can control the sugar on the first day itself or maximum by the 2 days if we start this sample prescription. How we can monitor? We should check RBS at least 4 times before breakfast, before lunch, before dinner, as well as bedtime. You do an adjustment of regular insulin according to the GRBS value. You can always use an insulin sensitivity factor, which I have told before. And then glargine dose has to be adjusted according to the fasting glucose value. You can always increase the glargine dose by 2 to 4 units according to fasting. And dose of NPH again, NPH which is given prior to steroid, again has to be adjusted according to the steroid. As if you have to increase the steroid, you have to increase the NPH dose also. So this is how we can manage the patient. And at last, if we are planning to discharge the patient, so just we have to ask ourselves some questions like, was the patient having pre-existing diabetes? Or is it just a transient hyperglycemia due to steroid? Or is it just a COVID-19 induced hyperglycemia? Then just see if check the HbA1c, if it is more than 6.5, or patient is already was on drugs, anti-diabetic drugs before admission. So consider that patient is already was having a pre-existing diabetes. And then foremost and most important, whether steroid has to be continued or not. So if there can be again the two scenarios where at discharge we have to give steroid, and another scenario where we can stop the steroid. If we are continuing steroid to that patient, so again we have to look which steroid. If we are thinking of starting a prednisolone or methylprednisolone once a day in the morning, look for the fasting glucose, and fasting glucose, if it is high, consider again giving a basal regimen, NPH prior to prednisolone and basal insulin glargine. But if sugars are fasting sugars are not that high, we can skip this glargine. We can just start NPH plus oral anti-diabetic drug. So we can stop the bolus part. We can just have to give NPH prior to steroid. But if patient has to given this dose in a quite high amount and huge amount, and twice to thrice a day you have to give prednisolone, and HbA1c of that patient is already quite high, always consider a basal bolus regimen. But if HbA1c was still not that high and patient has to begin huge amount of steroid, you just give a basal insulin and oral anti-diabetic drug. So this is how we can also plan a discharge of the patient who are or supposed to be started on steroid. And if the patient are not to be started, steroid has to be discontinued, then our job become much simpler, easy. HbA1c, just check the HbA1c on admission. Was HbA1c less than 7? So if the HbA1c was less than 7 and patient was already on drug, that means that his sugars were well controlled with this drug. So you can always uh, patient was already on anti-diabetic drug, so that means that patient was already well controlled with that drug, so you can always continue the previous medication. But if HbA1c was between 7 to 9%, that means moderately high, that not too high, you can always intensify the anti-diabetic drug. And if HbA1c was more than 9%, you can have to consider starting insulin to that patient, especially the basal insulin or basal bolus or premix, any of this can work. Ask them to monitor our fasting and PPBS daily for 2 weeks and report if any of the sugars is more than 200 or less than 70. So this is just a one real life case. This patient, 65-year-old male with HbA1c of 8.5 was admitted, and his sugar was 465. He was supposed to be started on dexamethasone. Patient was started on insulin infusion because his sugars were 400. And on the first dose of glargine was given prior to dexamethasone. Infusion was eventually discontinued the same day when the sugar became less than 200. Next day, when I saw the patient on ward, morning glucose value was 185. Because fasting was high, glargine was again added at night. And this was the time when we added acarbose 3 times a day, liraglutide 0.6 mg before lunch, and a Fiasp was added. On third day of admission, patient had very good glycemic control. And contrary to popular belief, what we think that liraglutide might have gastroparesis as well as acarbose, these OAD were very well tolerated in this patient. And obviously, we have to always consider the cost if patient can afford or not. So at the end, I will just like to give few messages. First is the preemptive management. Tackle the hyperglycemia before or along with the steroid. That is the first star management. We should always give we should always give insulin dose prior to giving a steroid jab in order to prevent the glucose toxicity vicious cycle. If we skip this effect and if sugars become more than 400, 500 for 1 to 2 days, it will become very difficult for us. And in spite of giving more than 100 or 200 unit insulin, you will not be able to control the sugar of this patient. So this is the most important step where we should always give an insulin prior to giving a steroid. And for sugar more than 400, always consider starting an insulin infusion and target the sugar between 140 to 180. And if the glucose values are between 200 to 400 and cost is not in the issue, consider giving NPH prior to steroid, glargine in the evening, short-acting insulin, liraglutide, as well as acarbose. And when cost is constrained, you can always give NPH in the morning, NPH in the evening, short-acting insulin, DPP-4 inhibitor, and voglipose. And instead, you can always combine the regular with NPH. You can use 30/70 2 times a day and regular insulin just in the afternoon. This can also be done in very cost constraints thing. And always you can add a DP4 or a voglipose or a acarbose. Target a glucose value of between 100 to 140, and pre-meal sugar between 100 to 140, and less than 180 is the post-meal. And always the discharge should be planned considering whether you have to start steroid or we have to stop the steroid. So thank you very much for patient listening. So any questions you can always are welcome, and I can. Yes, sir. Sir, your voice is very less. Yes, sir. if the patient is on already on insulin,
Insulin either on the mixed start or
Hmm.
in the glargine. So he has to stop and go for the regular insulin, but you have shown in your
yeah,
slide that you have
always
to, one has to go for the other.
best if the patient is getting hospitalized, it is always best to start basal bolus. If patient is on basal bolus, you can continue basal bolus. If patient is mixed start, you always tend to start basal bolus in that, because it will become very difficult for mixed start insulin two times to for us to control the sugar. It is very easy for us to, if we can give basal bolus regimen to that patient, plus one basal insulin prior to steroid also. So there will be two basal and three bolus, especially if the patient is starting on steroid.
And
So
after just if the patient is cured, and how long the इसका कितने दिनों तक effect रहता है?
for steroid,
Yes,
yes
and
sir. So that is
how
actually,
many weeks
yeah,
it lasts basically?
that depends upon the 5T half of the steroid. Sir, I have already told that dexamethasone might T half is almost around 36 to 50 hours. So you calculate the 5T half of that 50 hours. So it will be around 3 to 5 days. So till for dexamethasone, it can be till 5 to 7 days. For hydrocortisone, it will be much lower for 2 days. And for prednisolone, methylprednisolone, it will be around 3 days.
If the patient is already taking ORS, oral medicine,
Yes,
then
sir.
how long it will take? Another 4 weeks, or
So that is just a steroid is just causing insulin resistance and will increase the insulin doses in that patient. So patient was already having some sort of insulin resistance in him, that will continue. So you have to continue OAD. And once the steroid is stopped, the insulin resistance which was increased because of steroid, that will go away within 5 days, and his requirement of insulin or any anti-diabetic drug will come down.
thank you.
Yes. Yes, sir. Any question? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. This is actually available in stores. We can always give that CGM device to that patient. Doctor is supposed to put that CGM device. I have already used around 10 CGM device in my patient. Yeah, prescribed by us, and we can always give for it comes. It gives the 14-day reading, and we can get 1400 readings in 14 days. So we can go see all the reading. In fact, when you are sleeping also, we can also see that reading that time also. Every 15 minutes, it will be checking the sugar. So we can adjust your insulin sugar dose.
So
Yes, sir.
how much? So how much this continuous glucose monitoring cost?
Sir, Flash, there is a four devices which are available. Abbott is come with a flash glucose monitoring system. That sensor which I have shown is the cheapest one. It is available only with the cost of 2000, plus doctor cost will come around 2000 for reading. So it is always available with 4000 rupees. Other devices like Medtronics, their cost is quite high. That comes with 50 to 80,000 rupees. So Abbott has come with a very cheaper device, which 4000 is we can always use that device, and it is also available now in Jhansi also.
And what is the sensitivity of this glucose level? How much this correlate with the lab value?
Sir, actually, this is just it will come 15 to 20 lesser as compared to lab value. So we can always try and tend to increase, because it is not it is just a subcutaneous. We insert this device in subcutaneous, and the sugar in the subcutaneous space is measured. It is not that blood space. So that glucose comes 15 to 20 lesser. And in fact, it has been seen it comes 30 lesser. So,
Can you put the center in the vein? Are,
sir,
are any device available so the sensor can be put into the vein?
into the veins, sir, actually it will cause infections and all. So generally, and that will be painful also. So they are mainly coming to the device which are intradermal, epidermal, or subcutaneous, and that is very user friendly also. And when this thing is available, we should not go for the vein part.
And second question is,
Yes,
how
sir.
does the SGL2 inhibitors produce ketosis?
So, yeah, euglycemic ketosis, sir.
Yeah.
In this, you will specially find that sugar might be just 200 or 250, and instead of that, patient is having ketosis. This is because of the increased glucosuria. the insulin production from the pancreas will become less. Plus, SGLT2 tend to increase the glucagon also. So the insulin glucagon ratio hampers. Increased glucagon and decreased insulin will cause increased gluconeogenesis in the liver. So that will cause breakdown of the fat and will produce ketones. So that is more of fat breakdown. And this is also one mechanism why SGLT2 is helpful in cardiac disease. Because of the ketotic state, this beta hydroxybutyrate which is produced is very helpful, not in cardiac disease, but in atherosclerosis. And that is what the concept of intermittent fasting also comes. When you are fasting, there's again a ketotic state produced in your body, and that intermittent fasting will again be very helpful. So all these agents which are producing mild ketotic state might be very helpful in reducing weight, reducing atherosclerosis, as well as resistance to every disease which we are getting. So both of these agents might be very helpful and has been found in multiple studies also that SGLT2 is very useful.
So they produce ketonuria
Sir,
always.
they don't produce ketonuria. Beta hydroxybutyrate increase,
Ah.
that is not secreted. Acetone is secreted in the
Ah.
urine. So that's
This-
why for serum beta hydroxybutyrate will be high.
Acha,
It
this
might
will,
be high.
this will be high, but this does not cause metabolic acidosis.
So that will cause metabolic acidosis also because of the
Also.
ketone. But that will be like a euglycemic ketosis because sugars will be low because SGLT2 is causing all the glucose out from the urine. So the sugars will be between 200 to 250, but ketones will be high, and ketones tend to produce acidosis.
So when the so these patients will have chronic acidemia, will have further complication of acidemia like bone loss,
Yes, sir, that
osteoporosis.
acidosis will not only the ketones produce, and when the patient is dehydrated, and then only the acidosis part comes up. So these patients only have the ketone. But if the patient is not taking lot of water, if patient is lean thin, and patient is especially type 1 diabetes, when they have absolute insulin deficiency, they tend to develop and type chronic duration of type 2 diabetes when the beta cell exhaustion take place. So that is the those are patient may might develop euglycemic ketosis, especially in surgery hospitalized patient. They tend to have already have some amount of acidosis, and this might get precipitated. Only then they will develop. Otherwise, SGLT2 will not have any part of acidosis.
Lentus work for 18 hours or 24 hours.
So duration of action, it's like 18 to 24 hours.
So why this is preferred with dinner? Why not with the
So we
breakfast?
can give it in morning also.
Both
It's not like that. Because we are it depends upon the patient profile. We tend to generally we tend to control the fasting for fasting blood sugar. We tend to give fast Lantus. So its duration of action is 18. It doesn't have a peak, but its action might be maximum at 12 hours because the duration of action is 18 to 24 hours. So for controlling fasting, we have to give Lantus at night. Some sort of patient might be such where fasting is not that high, but pre-prandial pre-dinner is high. So in that patient, we can always give Lantus in the morning to control the pre-meal that time.
Thank you, Ansul. Very nice talk.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so I will present the next speaker then. Dr. Amit can hand over the session.
Thank you, Dr. Agrawal. Good evening to all of you. Uh, Respected Principal, Professor N.S. Sengar sir, our Vice Principal Ansul Jain sir, our Banoria sir, and additional CMO Dr. Kulset sir. Today, I'm going to present a PPT on psychology of COVID patient. So after hearing this, many things comes in our mind. Why during this COVID period, mental health is so important. Why we are discussing on this topic. So today I will tell all the possible psychiatric illness which can be seen commonly during this pandemic, and I will tell the importance of these psychiatric illness, why we are so worried. So first I would like to start with WHO definition about mental health. It's a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his community. So if you are able to cope with the normal stresses of life, welcome sir. So first of all, I would like to define WHO mental health, a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to each community. So, if if you are able to cope the normal stresses of life, your life is productive and fruitful, and you are making contribution for your society, means you are mentally healthy. Now we will discuss the psychosocial factor responsible for psychiatric disorder. Actually, mainly three factors are responsible for generation of any psychiatric disorder. One is biological, second one is psychological, third one is social factor. So biological factor we can't modify because it's related to our gene, but in psychological factor and social factor we can modify it. Psychological factor, like in this pandemic, our emotion like anger, guilt, and grief, our negative thoughts like hopelessness, helplessness, our negative belief about the outbreak, those affected by it. These are the psychological factors. And social factors includes we are away from our family, our economic factors, stigma and discrimination associated with COVID-19. So when these psychological factor and social factor interact with each other, they influence our mental health. Apart from these factors, direct effect of COVID-19 virus and increased immunological markers are also responsible for producing neuropsychiatric symptoms. So first of all, we'll start with depression. What is depression? Depression can affect individual at any stage of the lifespan. Average age of onset is early 20s to early 30s, and its a point prevalence is 1.9% for men and 3.2% in women. If we talk prevalence over period of 12 months, it will be 5.8% for men and 9.5% in women. So now we'll see the sign and symptom of depression. We can divide all the symptoms into uh, two classes. One is major signs, another is minor signs. In major signs, you can get generalized lack of interest, easy fatiguability, and persistent low mood. But major symptoms are only important for making diagnosis. If one is present, we can say it's a depression is mild. If two symptoms are present, we will say this is a moderate depression. If all three are present, we can say it's a severe depression. So, but minor symptoms are very important because patient will always tell this thing कि डॉक्टर साहब नींद नहीं आती है, भूख नहीं लगता है, बीवी में इंटरेस्ट नहीं है, सेक्स में इंटरेस्ट नहीं है, पढ़ने में मन नहीं लगता है. So after hearing these type of symptoms, you have to inquire whether it's a mild depression, moderate depression, or severe depression. You have to ask कि are uh, if there is persistent feeling of sadness, if there is loss of interest in activity, then you can say it's a moderate to severe depression because EG fatiguability is feature of COVID-19 and it is also a feature of depression. So nowadays we are not considering EG fatiguability as a feature of depression. So in case of severe depression, just before the suicide, patient develop negative thinking about their self, about the world, and about the future. Patient started thinking She used to think that I'm ugly, I'm worthless, I'm a loser. For world, she used to think no one loves me, and for the future, she used to think I'm hopeless because things will always be like this way. After that, within 6 months, they can commit suicide. So first we'll see the psychosis. After that, I will discuss the suicide and its prevention. Because suicide is more common in depression and psychosis only. So first we'll discuss psychosis. Psychosis is characterized by presence of hallucination, delusion, disorganized speech, and abnormal posture. So as we know, hallucinations are perception without stimulus, and delusion is fixed and false belief. So in hallucination, many types of hallucination are possible, like tactile hallucination, auditory hallucination, visual hallucination. And in delusion, we can get delusion of grandiosity, persecutory type of delusion, and delusion of love. Many types of delusion exist. So if there is hallucination and delusion, both are present, we can say psychosis. But most of the time, patient won't tell you. If you'll ask, are you hearing some unusual voice? Patient will say no. Most of the time, patient party, you have to ask the patient party, क्या अकेले बैठ करके चुप खुद से बातें करता है, अकेले बैठ के मुस्कुराता रहता है, कभी डर के बेड के नीचे छुप जाता है, कभी घर से भाग जाता है. These things indicate that he is hearing some voices. If you want to know about the delusions of a patient, you have to ask like, क्या बिना बात के झगड़ा करता रहता है, खुद अपना खाना खुद बनाता है, दूसरे का दिया हुआ नहीं खाता है. It indicate that persecutory ideas are there. Patient think that they are mixing poison in my food. Because of that, he is cooking food himself. So sometimes they used to burn his cloth because they think that the family member, they are tracking me. They inserted a chip in my cloth, and by that way they are tracking me. So these are the things we have to ask from the patient party. Now we will see the suicide. Suicide is among the top three cause of death among youth worldwide. According to the WHO, every year almost 1 million people die from suicide, and 20 times more people attempt suicide. A global mortality rate of 16 per 1 lakh, or one death every 40 seconds, and one attempt every 3 seconds on average, recorded. Because it's a WHO data. He says every 40 seconds one patient is committing suicide. So 1993 WHO established a clear-cut connection between suicide and mental disorder. They found that out of 6,003 suicides, 98% patient had a psychiatric disorder, why, in which 24% patient was having this affective disorder, means related to depression and mania. 22% patients showed neurotic and personality disorder. 16% had substance use disorder. 10% had schizophrenia. 21% had other mental disorders. Only in 2% cases, no psychiatric diagnosis could be made. So, unipolar major depression ranked fourth after the lower respiratory tract infection, diarrheal disease, and prenatal condition. It's a data from 1993 WHO study conducted by Bartlett. The global burden of unipolar major depression is 5.7%, will be a close second to ischemic heart disease. This is the prediction made in 1993 by WHO, and as of now, we talk about total burden. When we talk about total burden, mental disorder, which is 9.7%, rank just below the cardiovascular disorder, which is 10.5%. So now I will share some studies after the first wave of COVID. Barbis et al. In 2016, Thakur and Jain in 2020 reported anxiety, panic, pervasive feeling of hopelessness and desperation, frustration, uncertainty, and an increase in suicidal behavior during pandemic. In And in a meta-analysis of 31 studies conducted in China in 2020, found that the approximate prevalence of depression was 45%, anxiety was 47%, and sleep disturbance was 34% amongst individuals diagnosed with COVID-19 across different studies. In an early systemic review, Rogers in 2020 warned of the possibility of neuropsychiatric sequelae of acquiring COVID-19, including depression, anxiety, fatigue, post-traumatic stress disorder. One study conducted at LLRM Medical College by Professor Gyanendra Kumar shows the occurrence of symptom of anxiety 41.9% and depression 37.5% among the healthcare worker during first wave of COVID. So how to prevent suicide? So we always should remember one acronyms WAIT. WAIT, W for watch out for the sign of distress and changes in behavior. A, ask, are you having some suicidal thoughts? Then say it will pass. Assure your loved one that with the help, their suicidal feeling will pass with time. And talk to the others. Encourage your loved one to seek help from the general practitioner or health professional. Now we'll discuss role of antidepressant and antipsychotic in suicide prevention. If possible, refer to us. If anybody is having suicidal thought and suicidal thoughts are very intense, and if it is possible, then refer to us, we will manage that part. But if it is not possible because of some reason, then always prefer fluoxetine. You can give 20 or 40 milligram, and you can start lithium 400 milligram BD. Only one requirement, only one thing you have to do on day 5, you have to go for serum lithium. If serum lithium level comes more than 1.2, you have to decrease the dose. And one thing always remember, you have to tell the patient party to practice anti-suicidal precaution during first month, because after getting medication during third week, most of the patient commit suicide. It's because suicidal thoughts are there, but during depressive phase, they are unable to execute that plan. But when we start the antidepressant, their this motivation comes, and that thought, that with the help of that thought, they commit suicide. They can buy rope. Now they can buy rope. They can fix it. They can hang. So in case of psychosis, there is a command hallucination in which patient can suicide under the influence of that command hallucination. Means patient will hear some voice, and that voice will command him, okay, go to sixth floor and jump from that, or jump from there. So in that scenario, you have to use clozapine with other antipsychotics, because clozapine and lithium, we have only two medication having anti-suicidal property. Now we'll see the anxiety disorder. It's the most common disorders during COVID period. Symptoms we can divide in motor symptom and autonomic and visceral symptom. In motor symptoms, we can get tremor, restlessness, muscle twitches, fearful facial expression. In autonomic and visceral symptom, palpitation, tachycardia, sweating, flushes, dyspnea, hyperventilation, constriction in the chest, dry mouth, frequency and hesitancy of micturition, dizziness and diarrhea is possible. BP low हो गया था. It's a very common finding in Bundelkhand region. Most of the time, patients are coming to our OPD with this complaint कि डॉक्टर साहब बीपी कम हो गया था, एक ग्लूकोज की बोतल चढ़ाया, उसके बाद ठीक हो गया. तो this thing is most commonly that lady is suffering from anxiety disorder. Panic disorder is an acute, discrete episode of severe anxiety characterized by feeling of impending doom known as panic attack. Means यहाँ पे सारा फीचर एंजाइटी के होंगे. फीचर हाइपरवेंटिलेशन हो सकता है, एनीथिंग इज पॉसिबल विथ feeling of impending doom. Means patient will think that he will die within 2 to 3 minutes. So in panic disorder, these episodes can vary from having multiple attacks over a day to only a few attacks occurring in a year. Now, epidemiology of anxiety disorder. Anxiety disorder constitute most common group of psychiatric disorder. In the National Mental Health Survey 2016, disorders had a prevalence of 3.5%. Global account for around 10% disability caused by all mental, neurological, and substance use disorders, and are second only to the depression. And women are more likely to have an anxiety disorder than men. I want to show one Lancet Psychiatry, the one journal Lancet Psychiatry. This is a cohort study, and they have taken 236,379 COVID-19 survivor. It's a retrospective study, and they estimated incidence of neurological or psychiatric diagnosis in the following 6 months was 33.62%, with 12.84% patient received their first such diagnosis. For patients who had been admitted to an ICU, the estimate incidence of a diagnosis was 46.42%, and for a first diagnosis was 25.79%. If we talk about individual diagnosis, 17.39% patient were known case of anxiety disorder. They develop anxiety during uh, admission phase. 1.4% patient develop psychotic disorder, 0.456% cases develop intracranial hemorrhage during 6 months, 6 months after the post-COVID period, and 2.10% of cases develop ischemic stroke, 0.1% develop Parkinsonism. So now we'll see the delirium. Delirium is a organic brain injury. It's a sudden in onset which with fluctuating course. Symptom is confusion, hallucinatory behavior, as I told you previously. In delirium, visual hallucination is more common. Irrelevant talk, restlessness, agitation, and illusion are common symptoms of behavior, and it is commonly seen in ICU setting. High-grade fever and electrolyte imbalance you can see in this type of patients. One thing is sundowning phenomena. It is pathognomic feature of delirium. Most of the time during evening they develop this type of psychotic feature. So now we will see the management of the all the disorders I have discussed. So in delirium, you have to give haloperidol 2.5 to 5 milligram, but you have to check the pulse rate before giving injection haloperidol or tablet haloperidol. If pulse rate is more than 120, never give haloperidol because it can cause arrhythmia. In that case, we can give olanzapine 5 to 10 milligram. In acute psychosis, we can give risperidone 4 to 8 milligram per day with triacifenidil and olanzapine. The other means risperidone or olanzapine, you can choose one. And this is recommended drugs for acute psychiatric condition in patient with COVID-19. This is NIMANS guideline. In anxiety, we can give lorazepam 1 to 2 milligram, and for long-term treatment, we can give escitalopram. For depressive disorder, we have two options, either escitalopram or sertraline. Sertraline we can give up to 50 to 100 milligram per day. For insomnia, we can give lorazepam 1 to 2 milligram, but when benzodiazepine are contraindicated, we can give amitriptyline, zolpidem, trazodone, and quetiapine. The most important thing is judicious use of benzodiazepine. Most of the doctors, they are using nitrazepam, clonazepam, lorazepam, etizolam, and chlordiazepoxide during delirium phase. And this is dangerous because if you give these medications, patient will develop severe type of delirium. And these tablets are addictive also, so to always use judiciously. And if you think that patient is suffering from anxiety disorder, we can give in insomnia, we can give for short duration, not more than 2 weeks. And my suggestion, we need to start tele-psychological support service for Bundelkhand region, like other state, Tripura and Uttarakhand. We required only 5 to 10 clinical psychologists. We can offer this job to ex-demonstrator of psychiatry department currently posted in Jhansi. MSW degree holders are students. MA, BA psychology degree holders, we can involve all of them for tele psychological support. And we need support of local authority like CMO and district mental health officer for implementation of such type of program. So my last slide, there is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path. Thank you.
Amit, you spoke very well. You know, there is a humanity. Once somebody is born, somebody is ultimately is after some time, 7 to 8 years dies. So what was this? Gautam Buddha left everything. What was this?
Nirvana.
What was this? In your scientific word, how do you define leaving Buddha everything?
Sir, I don't know.
Matlab,
Nirvana in
he
Hindi,
left
I think
everything.
Nirvana is a Nirvana.
He left everything, went to forest and suffered and what was that? Is there any term in your psychiatry or psychology for this?
Maybe sir, psychologist will tell. Sir, I'm psychiatrist. I don't have knowledge.